Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Clayton, and I'm a program manager here at the University of Maryland in the Robert H. Smith School of Business, Office of Executive Education. We're very glad to have you with us today for this session on what every manager should know about neurodiversity. First, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Nicole Coomber and Jane Singleton. Nicole is a professor here at the Smith School, and Jane is the founder and executive coach at Launchpad for Life. Between the two of them, they have years of experience in research and field work with individuals and organizations. For the first part of the presentation, we will discuss neurodiversity in general before we move on to a case study about adapting systems and communication to leverage strengths. Then we'll talk about examples in real workplaces and adapting to your organization before we take your questions. You can type your questions into the Q&A and we'll take the time to answer them at the end of the presentation. Now I'd like to hand it over to Nicole for understanding neurodiversity.
Thanks, Clayton. Welcome, everyone. As Clayton said, my name is Nicole Coomber. Sorry, I'm just cleaning my glasses. We're going to get started by actually giving some definitions around what we're talking about today, because everybody sort of benefits from being on the same page as far as what we're talking about. So I'm going to go into two terms, neurodiverse and neurodivergent, and then we'll also talk about a third term called neuroinclusion. So neurodivergent encompasses kind of a wide array of unique cognitive traits. Typically, we think of these as being criteria for an actual diagnosis as one of these conditions. And they're usually seen as distinct differences in brain function from what the statistical norm is. So sometimes folks will say, well, I also struggle with some of these same challenges, but I'm not neurodivergent. And it's because, it just depends on how many of these different traits that someone struggles with in order to meet the criteria to actually kind of qualify as neurodivergent. But these are sort of a lot of differences that occur just naturally in people. And so neurodiverse recognizes that neurological differences are natural human variations rather than seeing it as a deficit. It's really about brain differences and figuring out how people can work with their brain and the way their brain works. And also you and how you can work with them as kind of a manager. I'm also going to go into another term, which is neuroinclusion. This comes up in a lot of these spaces, and after Jane talks through some case studies, I'm going to go into kind of two organizations that use this term. So this is really kind of on the forefront of how organizations are talking about these differences. And so neuroinclusion is this authentic inclusion of all these different cognitive typologies, which includes neurodivergent people, neurotypical people, where people kind of feel like they can find a sense of belonging with what works for their own brain, without kind of being forced to be like someone else. This is sort of a book that comes from that we recommend. It's not sort of a book, it is a book. It's called The Neurodiversity Edge by Maureen Dunn. And so this is a great one for managers who are looking to learn more about neurodiversity. So now that we've done the definitions, let's go on to how many adults actually identify as neurodivergent. Might surprise you to find out that actually 19% of American adults, of adults in the US, identify as neurodivergent. What we are seeing in these trends, and this is a YouGov poll that was done fairly recently, I think in 2023, this poll was done. A greater share of younger Americans are identifying as neurodivergent than older Americans. And this was part of, if you are like me and you went to elementary school in the 80s, the criteria for what meant, for what autism, ADHD, ADD at the time meant, much more narrow criteria. And so we're understanding more how brains work. And so it's part of the expansion of more people that are self-identifying as neurodivergent. So we are going to launch a little poll. I'll pass it over to Clayton to do that, to ask you if you are managing someone who identifies as neurodivergent.
Everyone, you should see a poll on your screen. I'm seeing some results coming in. That's great. Let's just take a few more seconds to let everybody answer the question, and then we'll share the live results so everyone can see what people on the call are seeing in their workplace. So let's just take about 5 more seconds. All right, I'm going to end that poll now. and share the results on our screen.
So mix, we've got 37% who are, 27% who are not, and then folks who are not sure. And it's true, we don't have to disclose, people don't have to disclose their status of neurodiversity in the workplace unless they're actually seeking formal accommodations. So we will go ahead and close that. And I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Jane. I've had the pleasure of working with over the past few months, discussing this topic and ways that we can help organizations learn more and have a more neuro-inclusive perspective. And so she's going to go through a case study. Jane.
Thanks, Nicole. So I'm going to talk about a common case study, something that I've seen pop up with my clients because I specialize in doing career and leadership coaching with neurodivergent individuals. So this is about perspective taking. So David, in this example, David excels at solving complex problems. He has a lot of creative input in meetings to improve workflow, unique ideas, especially in a crisis, because he recognizes these patterns over time and these details. His manager loves that about him, but his manager has become frustrated because there's inconsistencies in his work, and he tends to miss deadlines. Sometimes he's showing up late to meetings or sending work along to his manager that isn't, in his words, detailed enough. And sometimes is seen by his team as undependable because of these things. Now, these are two completely different perspectives, but when we're comparing two different perspectives, we're really missing out on a key piece, which is what is happening in the organizations from a system perspective. So Clayton, can you click the next button? These are the details that matter to identify the right problem. David's role is requiring a list of disparate tasks with constant notifications, with vague deadlines and no framework. I don't know how many of you in the room can relate to setting aside a big picture planning day, and then you're just constantly getting pinged. And that can really create an emotional dysregulation, especially for somebody who's neurodivergent, of like, how do I prioritize tasks? That's probably the number one complaint from both young, early career individuals, but also for individuals who become in leadership, and you're getting pulled on all these different projects, but nobody's really streamlining things. And so you feel like you're disappointing people no matter where you go, and there's really no way to sift through and prioritize. So there's vague deadlines that are like, hey, let me know when you can get it to me, or whenever you can get it to me. And the constant context switching, which switching in and of itself is part of executive functioning. And that creates more drain to switch between tasks in that way versus having larger chunks of time to hyper focus on one project. And so this is where we kind of come about to like, are we really leveraging David's strengths if we're not honoring as his manager these larger chunks of time to hyper focus, which is a strength of ADHD and other neurodivergent diagnoses. You can go along to the next slide. This is the ultimate question we should be asking ourselves as leaders. How can we step away from the initial behavior that we observe and think about how would we problem solve if we thought systems and informational channels were faulty versus people? In the example that I talked about, it's not so much that David is in the wrong or that the manager's expectations are in the wrong. What we're missing out here is we're not pinpointing the correct problem, but it is our job as leaders to facilitate a conversation and open up what are the system barriers that are getting in the way of you being on time? What are the communication structures that are making it more difficult for you to be productive? That's actually taking an objective stance to make sure that we're actually creating a safe environment to share those thoughts instead of jumping to this conclusion where we're entering into a conflict. And the cost of that inflexibility of forcing like a valuable employee to work within a rigid system, that can lead to burnout, poor morale, and then you're losing talent that you really want to keep in the workplace. So facilitating these conversations are essential. And just to speak to those neurodivergent profiles, there's tons of people who might be diagnosed with ADHD, but are also gifted in specific areas that can do things that other people on your team cannot. And you don't really want to lose that talent. You want to make sure you're honing in on what the actual barriers are and then balancing that within your team. So let's go on to the next slide. So executive functioning, I think, is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but there's not a simple definition to this. Executive functioning involves multiple different types of cognitive processes, um, including the ability to plan, sustain attention, retaining information, which is really working memory. And working memory really relates to when we're learning something brand new. I'm going to pause and talk about this one for just a little bit longer because I think what's interesting about the brain is that how we're able to learn novel information also shifts with age. So before you're 25, your frontal lobe is not fully formed. And so you're still actually like rising to your full potential of executive functioning, which is why for those of you who might manage younger employees, they're just not quite putting maybe the initiation of tasks together. They're still struggling with like how to organize and streamline things. They do need more guidance. It's not just in your head. And they need that scaffolding. And that's part of that leadership and growth, which I get it. As managers, we're constantly just trying to find ways to find more time, but we do need to honor like where the brain is at. I'm going to also go on the reverse side because I'm not an ageist at all. And the truth is at a certain point in age is our working memory capacity starts to lower. It is harder to learn new things. I don't think it is a coincidence that like generationally older people have a harder time when we're switching LMS systems or integrating new technology because it does take more time and effort to learn and it is a more frustrating process. So we do need to think about that when we're potentially giving leadership roles with new technology, et cetera, and really think about what is the neurodiversity on this team and how can we leverage those strengths so that we can be more productive, efficient, and just everybody's kind of got the right role on the project. Cognitive flexibility is a lot about just adapting to new situations. So I see this as two things. I see one is transition. Transitions are harder for people who are neurodivergent most of the time, meaning they do need to know what's coming and why. And then also sometimes transferring information into a new and novel situation. That context is so important to give them. I would also like to just highlight from clients that I've had, a lot of them have shared with me like that their boss won't share like the bigger picture details and the context. And for them, the why is so important to their motivation. They don't feel motivated. It's really hard to be motivated to do your work when you don't feel like you're part of a bigger picture. Like, where is my work headed? What am I contributing to? It's not because they don't care. They desperately want to see the value in how they're spending their time. So connecting those dots is super essential. And inhibitory control has a lot to do with just like self-regulation and self-monitoring. You might think about that task monitoring, the double checking, and also like when new information is inserted, how do I then adjust and change direction? And last but definitely not least is reflection. I think reflection, we talk about it a lot with our evaluation process as leaders and check-ins. But what we tend to do, especially if we're in a rush, is we're reflecting on behalf of the people that we manage. It is so important that you let those you manage take the lead in that reflection process, because you're going to get a picture of like, what's their baseline? What are they self-aware about? If they are not aware, that lets you know as a manager, I might need to bring it back to the basics because they're not aware of these things. So the question is like, where has the communication dropped off and what's the missing link there? so that you're not starting above where they are, right? Because then you get that shock value and you're getting emotional dysregulation. And guess what? When I'm emotionally dysregulated, my attention is horrible, my working memory is horrible, and I'm not really listening to anything that you're saying. So it becomes a waste of time for both of you. Okay, if I didn't overwhelm you with that, we can go on to the next slide. Can you tell I love this? This is my world. Okay, so this is a little bit of just like an example. Going back to that question I asked earlier of how can we get past our reaction to the initial observed behavior and dig a little bit deeper as managers. So these might be observed behaviors that you see for someone who struggles with attention and executive functioning. The difficulty with task initiation, they might appear if they're not listening, time management deadlines, disorganized. You might think that they're unmotivated, and that's where maybe there's a lack of alignment there, and the switching between tasks. Before we move to the next slide, the key question here that we're going to ask, we're going to move from this, which is what everyone does, right? We judge. That's where we go. We're like, oh my gosh, this person, they're so disorganized. That's like the human nature piece. Now we're going to take this information and instead we're going to do a systems reframe on the next slide. So this is a systems problem reframe. Organizational processes lacking clear structured initiation points can create barriers for diverse cognitive styles in starting tasks. A lack of chunk time for hyperfocus negatively impacts productivity, leading to bad time management. Vague language as it relates to prioritizing deadlines. So if your organizational structure is, you have an employee that's reporting to multiple managers, like how have you at least told the employee, hey, this is how you communicate with us to self-manage, but what's the plan for that? Because that's a lot to put on somebody who is especially junior level. It's very hard to say, like, I don't have time to do that, or I'm not going to make these deadlines. So just make sure that all the managers that person is working with, there's some sort of streamlined protocol for communication along those lines. And this is a big one. Meetings are not structured and systems are not in place for structured note taking or labeling. I can't tell you how many organizations I walk into. It's like when everyone takes their own notes, you're increasing risk of like, did everyone get the same message? That shared note taking, if you're depending where your company is at with AI, because I totally get private information, confidentiality, all of that. But Asana is a great tool, but don't wait to do the meetings after. That should be very clearly written and a visual aid within the meeting, right? Like whose task is this as you go through the meeting, because you're directing attention in the meeting and there's no question, what email do I look through in the thousands of emails I have for what I'm supposed to do? It's all in one place and it's organized and it's streamlined. All right, we can go to the next one. Even though I kind of started in on the solutions on the last slide, the vague language piece, really just clarifying those deliverables when we circle back. I think clear lists and making sure that they're written and not just verbal. Designing workflows that incorporate task rotation. What are the opportunities to hand off detail-oriented tasks to automated systems, right? So the revising and the editing. When do we allow our employees to say, hey, listen, I'm really bad at this discrete task? I think that's kind of important to talk amongst your teams with, and make sure you have the best person for the job for those final detail pieces. This last one, providing flexible work arrangements. This is so important because environment for neurodivergent individuals is essential. It's not just a preference. Sensory needs such as light, sound, how easily we get distracted from those things as well as other people and interruptions can make a huge difference in our success at a job or not. And then really for like evaluations and check-ins, make sure that there's collaborative reflection, but also collaborative goal setting. we want to make sure we're reducing the misinterpretation of the problem. Going back to that case study with David, is he could name what the problem is, right? That systems problem of why he was having trouble moving forward. But the manager maybe thought it was just he has bad time management. So we need to make sure we're naming the same problem and asking the question, this is what I see, but like, what do you think the problem might be? We can go to the next slide. And this is just a kind of a general overview without having to know someone's specific diagnosis. These are really common pillars of a variety of different learning disabilities. Reading comprehension pops up a lot, and it's not just because of the intellectual ability to make inference and connections. That's not what I'm talking about. People with ADHD with visually dense materials, it's just harder. It's more of a visual scanning piece and that attentional piece. So like, how can we reduce the visual density of resources and emails? That's like question number one for me. I think there's a lot of emotional response for people who have dyslexia or ADHD, or if they had any sort of bad experience with reading and education. You see this big long email, I've already heightened somebody's emotional regulation. Whereas as a leader, I could have just put it in clear bullet points. Like, we need to think about how we're formatting the information, because I don't think anyone in here wants to end up repeating themselves or catching the mistakes of other people, but we really need to think about the clarity of our communication when we're delegating tasks. Language processing has to do with expressive and receptive language. So that is one's expressive is one's ability to kind of organize language and the speed at which one can do that. So some of your team members might do better if you give them a heads up about what the brainstorm meeting is going to entail so that they can collect their thoughts prior to the meeting. And or an alternative could be, we know that some people need more think time, so please feel free to send us any other ideas by the end of the day. And making sure not to put everybody on the spot. These are communication preferences that you can ask during onboarding. You don't have to ask for someone's diagnosis. These are purely communication preferences. Excuse me. I touched on sensory needs and environment. Remember, if there are sensory needs, one cannot kind of move forward and be productive if it's that distracting. There's like hypo and hyper sensory needs. I'm not going to get into that much detail, but I think you need to understand, like, it does impact the cognitive functioning if the sensory needs are not met. And social communication is really, we use a ton of socially nuanced language and communication, and we need to be really careful that we're not, and or at least giving opportunities to have those that we manage like explain things back to us, or say, hey, is what I said clear, or do you need any additional help? Those sorts of things. So just be wary of really vague language. And I know a lot of you probably already trained, like, SMART goals, being specific, measurable, really time oriented, making sure you're being really clear both in your written and verbal communication is essential. And on this note, thinking about these 4 areas: sensory needs, reading comprehension, language processing, and social communication, we're going to do another quick poll. And we just kind of want to ask, which process in your organization is the least neuro-inclusive? When you look at these kind of 4 things and how that might contribute to onboarding, evaluations, like communication protocols, teamwork, etc. While you guys fill this out, I love giving real world examples. So one example would be, we have Slack and email and in-person and all these different ways to communicate. And I've had, a lot of clients get in trouble because they use the wrong communication channel to talk about, concerns about a project, but no one's giving guidance on when we use what. And so that's really important just for like the social relationships on teams, because it's always harder and more time consuming to repair than like to be really proactive and intentional about communication channels that are used for certain types of communication.
Well, we've got some good responses here. About two-thirds of our attendees have participated. I'll give everybody just a few more seconds to answer that question, but I don't think you'll be surprised to see the results. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now and share the results.
Communication. I was going to guess that one.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the poll results now, and we can move on.
All right, we can go to the next slide. And so strategic task matching is really something you would do when you're facilitating teams. You might get one new member, even if you get one new member, or maybe you've completely reorganized your teams as a whole. I don't actually believe that you can leverage everyone's strengths until you create a culture in your organization where we can talk about weaknesses. There's not one person who doesn't have some level of weakness, and usually it is the task you hate. It's a task you like save and you procrastinate about. And the truth is that might not bother somebody else. So really thinking about how can I leverage the full strengths of my team? I do want to talk about when there's high interest, attention to detail is superb for people with ADHD and autism. That's like a misnomer. It's not that they can't have attention to detail. It has a lot to do with interest. So they're going to give you some really deep focus research, maybe more details than you ever could have imagined were possible, but you also might discover some really cool connections when they get to do a deep dive on something they have high interest in. I mentioned the pattern recognition before, identifying trends, system optimization, in particular, innovative thinking and out of the box solutions. People with dyslexia seem to have like just like a sixth sense for this. And it's almost very, in all the cognitive profiles I've seen, that piece and visual spatial skills are like very, very high. So thinking about how we can leverage these and give roles based on brain strengths is really important. And we'll go on to the next slide, Clayton.
Great. We have a question from Max, and we'll take those questions at the end. We definitely should have some additional time at the end to take a few questions. I'm going to go into a couple of examples of organizations who have done this really well. And let me find my link and put it in the chat. Because SAP has done really an incredible job of adapting their workplace to be neuro-inclusive. So I'm going to throw this link in the chat, and that links out to their resources. But basically, so SAP software company found that they had a lot of autistic employees, technically gifted, but struggling in some of the things that Jane is talking about around communication protocols and sensory environments, all of these things that, and at the time that they started it, I think some of these things were just beginning to be understood in how they affect people at work. So it started in 2013 as autism at SAP, and now they've transitioned to be neuro inclusion at SAP. It has involved over 240 colleagues, and they have developed a ton of resources that you could use it within your organization, scan through as to how they do things. They've also worked with other companies, over 125 companies, to inspire them as to how they can adapt their workplaces to be more inclusive of neurodivergent brains. I'm going to give two examples, and we'll talk about, I think these are right in line with everything that Jane has been saying for how you can adjust your workplace. So we don't get into as much the space around formal work accommodations. If someone comes in with HR within your organization and requests formal accommodations, then those things are kind of written down, and they're kind of part of what you need to provide for employees to be in accordance with kind of Americans with Disabilities Act. But you can still adjust your workplace without having those formal things to make it more adaptable for employees. So adaptable workspaces, this really gets into the sensory challenges that a lot of employees might face around things being too bright, things being too loud, or not having enough stimulation, the workplace being too quiet. So these are kind of, you can adapt the workplace to fit the needs. And a lot of employees or a lot of organizations are doing this with their flexible workspaces, hoteling spots. But if you need to think, and does this work for this individual employee? Is it too loud? Is it not loud enough? Is it, does it meet their kind of sensory needs to be able to let them to work there, do their best? The other thing is like things like written directions. This can just start to be a norm on the team. And we actually see some very high profile companies that do this. I was at our advisory council meeting on Friday, and we have folks from all different organizations come in who give advice to our master's programs and undergrad programs for curriculum, that kind of thing. And it got into a long conversation with someone from Amazon who was detailing how they have almost everything is written when they go into meetings. So they go into meetings, folks have to write things ahead of time so that everyone can kind of review. And it's a very clear process so that people know exactly what they have to prepare if they're writing the memo. As Jane was talking about, this kind of idea of shared note taking, really important. So those are a couple of things that you can sort of adjust your workplace using some of the techniques that Jane discussed as something that's kind of for everyone. It doesn't have to target just the neurodiverse employees. And then another thing you can do is to have some neutrally framed conversations with your team where they discuss something as simple as kind of work style profiles. There are tons of different resources out there. You may have internal things that you use at your company, like StrengthsFinder has been a popular one over the past several years. Um, the the StrengthsFinder has been a popular one over the past few years. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat that I will look at in a second. Um, the There's one that I have used with my MBA students called the Crystal Personality Assessment that is based on the Big Five personality assessments, which are more tied in with how people actually perform at work. I think SAP has their own work style profile that they recommend within the resources that they provide. Um, so this is a way to kind of get together with your team and talk about not necessarily like, oh, I have ADHD or, I have OCD and this is what it means, but it's just like, hey, here's how I work, because everybody has a work style profile, neurodivergent, neurotypical, whatever, right? Everybody has a work style profile. So it puts everybody on a level playing field, and it allows you to have a neutral conversation as to kind of preferences and how the team can accommodate them. And yes, the Natasha, thank you so much for including that. This is for folks who are at UMD. If a employee reaches out and discloses their neurodiversity to you, she is there to talk to you about it. It's a great resource for folks who are here at UMD and working, and I know we have some of our colleagues on the call. I think that is all for SAP. Clayton, can you go on to the next example? So I love this. I came across this because I'm going to be going to a business school roundtable discussion around neurodiversity in the business school classroom. And we've got some folks from corporations that have come in, and one person that's going to be coming to this talk works at this EY, Center for Excellence. So this is actually a consulting practice that EY has developed to go out, and they charge companies to help them develop a policy that is disability talent management. And some of their findings were that, fewer than 3 in 10 companies have a disability talent management strategy. Maybe it's something informal, but it's certainly not a written practice. And as we're talking about, a lot of times having things written down is very helpful for creating a workplace that works for everyone. 15% of the global population, according to their data, identify as neurodivergent. And we've seen the statistics that a lot of those folks are unemployed or underemployed. I think some of those perceptions are changing as we kind of change diagnostic criteria. But it is definitely folks, we could tap into this workforce, which has a lot of the skills that are valuable in today's workplace. And then 92% of the companies that have worked with EY in this consulting practice they've done a better job than other tech companies in particular in retaining their neurodivergent talent. So again, you can look up, this is more of a report on sort of the results that they've seen at companies. And Max, I think you might benefit from looking at some of the work that they've done when you are looking at convincing folks about like, why should we do this, right? Because they've worked with a lot of companies in the tech industry to help folks understand like why, why these folks have offer benefit to the organization, to the bottom line. Um, I'm a big believer in like human dignity and treating everyone with respect, not just because of corporate profits, but that can be convincing when you are trying to convince folks. It's like, hey, this actually helps our business. It helps the work that we're doing. And that takes it outside of the kind of more ethical conversation. But there's some real benefits that companies have seen in talent retention. And so I think citing those statistics and helping people understand why it's beneficial can be great. All right, go on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to switch back to Jane, and she's going to do a bit of discussion around task analysis. And this is sort of modeling a conversation you can facilitate with your team as you're thinking about bringing these techniques back into your own workplace.
Thanks, Nicole. So just going back to this whole idea, that term we talked about earlier, which is like being neuro-inclusive. You don't need to be like an expert in learning disabilities as a manager. That's not the goal. And we definitely don't want to be prying into people's personal diagnostic information. That the idea here is to be curious, asking questions about work preferences. I know that with my clients, I build an identity dashboard because when we talk about reducing burnout and increasing engagement, like overall morale, it is key not to just talk about values, right? We talk about values a lot in leadership, but it's important to understand capacity because we all just have this one bucket, and regardless of emotional situations, contexts, interactions, or cognitive tasks, it's draining from the same bucket. And if I keep hitting that wall and I have to recover from it, it just takes a lot longer and it doesn't help with work productivity. So I would imagine most of you would agree that it's better to be proactive than reactive. That's something I'm very passionate about. So when you collect information on teams, you can get to know people's cognitive strengths most of the time by just understanding their preferences. So using keywords like what types of tasks really motivate you, like from your job responsibility. This is the project we have coming up. Like of these tasks, what feels really motivating and interesting to you, that you think you can stay focused on for a long time? What of closing this project deadline would bore you, right? Name it. I always say I have a theory. I always tell my clients, if you can name it, you can tame it. What types of tasks frustrate you? Now, this doesn't mean that you don't give anyone a task that bores or frustrates them. I want to be very clear, right? That's not how the world works. But by asking these questions, you can hopefully delegate the best way to delegate tasks within the team, but also how can those individuals manage their time throughout the week versus putting all those tasks that are maybe frustrating and boring into one small section of the week. And those understanding what types of interactions drain people is really a great way to understand communication preferences. Like in person could be more draining than email, etc., or virtual, all of those things. So these are just a basic takeaways. If you feel like you haven't done anything yet, you can take this to your next team meeting and say, I'm really trying to get to learn people's preferences a little bit more. And I think this is something that team members should share with each other. It's not just enough for you to know. The other team members should know too, because you're creating a more open culture around strengths and weaknesses. We can go on to the next slide. And then this is just another takeaway of like, how is a neuro-inclusive mindset different? As I said, it is human nature to kind of go in and react to a behavior and be judgmental about it. But I think we need to switch that to assume growth and learning are possible and that you just haven't named the right problem. So that assuming good intent, being aware of like verbal and nonverbal messaging, belief in change is required to grow anyone. Building in metacognition. Metacognition means your reflection on your own process of learning how you learn. So asking good questions, making sure that it's employee-led problem solving. I really don't think we do enough of this, is build self-monitoring systems, like have the employee build their own self-monitoring systems. How are you going to measure your progress on this? How are you going to monitor if you're on time? Have them create the system, and then they can reflect on that when you check in later. And of course, examine accessibility. Reflect on process. What is the technology we have for people who might do better by listening to text if they have to do research? How are we doing shared note taking? Really identify those barriers, and you can ask, what feels like an accessibility barrier to you to be successful at this job? That's a generic question without asking about diagnostics. And making sure that you make small shifts and supports based on that feedback. All right. Next slide. So these would be my recommended next steps for organizations. Neurodiversity training is just kind of, let's talk about all the different functions of the brain and have employees like relate to those different functions and how brains might differ, because you need that basic education baseline in order for people to be more understanding and less judgmental. I think it's a requirement of that. I've done a lot of awareness and education around different neurodivergent needs, and most people immediately go to being like compassionate and being like, oh, this is how I can shift. I had no idea they were doing this because of X. Neuro-inclusive onboarding, essential, right? That's people's experience at your organization right outside the door. And then career and talent development practices. And I know we've hit on the flexible workplace practices, but like environment's huge. That's your day-to-day productivity. So that's really going to have the biggest impact. Anything else to add, Nicole?
No, I think these are great. The one thing that I keep thinking of is a lot of the research on any sort of diversity training, and I know we're kind of in a cultural moment right now where it's harder to talk about like DEI, so to speak. But a lot of the training that folks have done, if you focus on kind of the deficit model or how people are different, then it actually has negative kind of flow back into the organization, where it doesn't sort of engender people to think of like
Mm-hmm.
being a bystander and how they can help others or even how they might benefit from some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So the cool thing about neurodiversity training is that all of us engage in executive functioning skills on a day-to-day basis. And you might be autistic, or you might be tired that day and have your working memory struggle. So if you build these practices into your day-to-day team, even folks, all of us have been through difficult times, whether it's grief, whether it's, significant illness. The one thing about disability conversations is disability is something that at some point we will all become disabled, whether temporarily or permanently. I've taken care of aging parents, and I've seen that, people sometimes struggle as they get into, later years post workplace. But even in the workplace, we all have our bad moments. We're all struggling with executive functioning at different times, and we may all be stronger on some skills than others. So neurodiversity training or executive functioning training and understanding how the brain works is super beneficial for any employee at any level, neurotypical, neurodiverse, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
It's really beneficial. I do a lot of coaching around goal setting with just employees at University of Maryland, not even specified out neurodiverse employees, and everybody has benefit from it. So there's a real benefit to all of your employees of doing these kinds of trainings.
Right. I love that, Nicole. And I would say too, just like knowing the awareness around your own emotional and cognitive capacity is essential to not reaching a crisis point. And you don't want someone else to reach a crisis point within your organization either, because that has a trickle down effect too. So, and I love that you mentioned a lot of assessments. I just want to do a quick thing, is like there's a PDP global behavioral traits assessment that's great, that actually names the behaviors you engage in when you're at capacity. So I really like that assessment. I do that with a lot of my clients and organizations. So I just want to put a peg in there, but I think we're almost at questions. Clayton, can you go to the next slide? Oh yeah, this is just my contact information. Please do connect with me on LinkedIn. If you couldn't tell from this presentation, I could talk about this all day. It's a deep passion of mine. I'm also going to plop that in the chat. And yeah, go ahead. I think we can move to questions.
Yeah, for sure. And we also, we're looking to, we have student teams who might be interested in taking some of SAP's workshop and working under guidance from me and Jane on working with your organization if it's something that is a cost barrier to, making some of these policies happen. Change management is hard, and so we have a lot of expertise. Obviously Jane does a lot of coaching. We also have expertise doing executive education around some of, with all types of organizations. And so do reach out to us and we can get you connected and figure out what might help you and your organization as you are looking to, improve your practices around neuro inclusion. So I think Max's question, Jane, I had some thoughts on it around kind of skepticism, and I think a couple of the examples that we gave could be useful in demonstrating other organizations and what they've done. The other thing is, I mean, obviously it comes back to, whom are you trying to influence and how do they prefer their information? Because there could be different strategies
Mhm.
around the benefits to the organization, the benefits to the team. But Jane, do you have any case studies or times when you've seen people overcome that resistance within organizations?
I always find the best way to deal with resistance is through curiosity. Um, so I think here, like how I would approach this is like understanding maybe what is at the heart, like the not what feels like the non-negotiable to this potential like older generation. If my leadership, what is the common ground piece? Naming the common ground piece first, and then identifying like we both probably have different approaches to reaching this particular outcome. And in order for me to do this in a timely manner and in the most efficient way and effective way, I need to go about it this way and the why. Could you explain to me your approach? So I think you have to leave that room for like a full explanation for the why right before you elevate to like a non-negotiable, if that makes sense. Like this is like saying something like this is just the only way I can do it, right? That is going to elevate, I think, emotions on both sides. So the curious piece, and really make sure you explain your why. I have found it so beneficial for all of my clients that have had to go to their bosses and managers to advocate for themselves. And as soon as you get enough detail as the why, usually the leaders understand like they recognize they don't get something or they learned a new piece of information. So that is my piece there. I don't know if you have anything to add to that,
No,
Nicole.
that's great. The next question, I know Reed asked about follow-up, and so Reed, I think reach out to either Clayton if you want to put your email in the chat, when you can also Jane has put her contact information there too. We can
Yeah.
talk further about how we might be able to help. I know that we had a question in the registration that someone gave us about career development and career progression. I don't know if that person is in the room, but we're happy to answer that question just around like how do we think about career progression and promotions for folks that fall into these neurodiversity categories. Jane, did you have thoughts on that you wanted to share?
Um, could you say that one more time?
Yeah, the question was, Clayton, I don't know if you have the words in front of you. Someone asked in the registration, how can I coach an employee around career progression when they are autistic? Like, is there any special considerations for coaching an employee when they are
Mm.
autistic for something like a promotion?
Right. So I'm gonna first start. This is gonna be a complex answer, but my like first question would be, what have you observed about their communication styles? Do they tend to be more of a black and white thinker? I think typically like discreet and direct is best for people on the spectrum, but you also have to give them, there is an emotional, how to explain this? I think it's really important to ask them their preference for feedback and let them ideally get a heads up about what you want to talk about in advance because you don't know about their previous experience with feedback. I think a lot of neurodivergent individuals have had really bad experiences with feedback where they haven't felt listened to. And so letting them sit, like getting the context of like, I really want to find the best way to like move forward on X problem and I might not have all the information. So I think some vulnerability is really important. You're some sort of value statement, like your opinion and ideas around what the root of the problem is are really important. I want you to feel heard, and offering this opportunity to send information in advance and asking them like, what would be your preferred format, like when we meet, or what information do you need prior to meeting so this meeting can go well. As much as you can ask them like direct bulleted questions, and try to avoid overly verbose language that is just filler. I call it filler language, and it's really distracting, I think, to a lot of people on the spectrum. Is like really getting to the point is super helpful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that the bullet pointed feedback, and then also I think being honest about the process is really important. Once you get the idea of how that individual prefers to get feedback, I think what happens sometimes in promotions within organizations and career progression within organizations is that sometimes there's like multiple factors that go into it, and needs might shift. And so there may not be a step by step, do these things and you will get this promotion. And a lot of autistic brains in particular really enjoy that certainty. There may not be that certainty. And so I think being honest and say, look, in general, this is what's happened in the past, but that's not always the case. There's sometimes other factors that go into it, like market needs, right? If you're developing a different kind of product, you may be looking for someone that has less experience, but certain skill set that's going to help develop that product for the market, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think the important thing is just being clear about that. Market needs might
Mm-hmm.
change. The what the organization needs might change. So in general, here are some guidelines, but it's going
Mm-hmm.
to vary depending on the context and the situation. And just being upfront and honest about that
Yeah.
is really, really important. So if there's any other questions, please pop that into the Q&A. Otherwise, we can hang out for a second. But Clayton, I guess you may want to close us out.
I do see one more question that
Oh,
just
perfect.
came
I
in,
didn't see that.
and
Oh, there
I'll
it
read
is.
it out. Or you see it? Okay. Okay.
Okay. I don't.
Okay,
Oh,
so the
oh.
question, I have an employee who seems quite happy and successful with their small picture detail-oriented work on the surface and doesn't seem like a good fit for larger creative pursuits. At the same time, there's a push in the organization to give everyone new creative challenges and not leave all the drudge work to one employee. Do you have any thoughts on how to build a creative challenge for strategy for someone who seems more aligned to keep plugging away at comfortable tasks? It's a good question.
It is a good question. I think, but I think when I like read this, all I keep thinking is like, there's two totally different perspectives here. I see the organizational, this is what I'm reading from this, and I absolutely love this example, is like, what I see is like an organizational initiative that is like one size fits all, meaning, hey, we don't want everybody to stay in the drudges, we want, because they want retention. And so they think they've made a blanket statement of like, if we give people creative pursuits, then we're going to retain more employees. But that's a one size fits all mentality. And so I think, yes, you should, of course, offer any and every opportunity from like an equitable standpoint of like, hey, these, like, this is an initiative of the company. If you're interested, these are the choices for creative pursuits. Are you interested in any of these? And then I would just lay them out and say, from a career trajectory perspective, this is what this could lead to, just so you're providing all the information for someone to make a good decision. But I don't think we should assume that is what this employee wants. And if anything, going back to how we said leveraging strengths, is like, I might be on that team and be like, I'm so glad somebody else wants to do this work because I'd rather do the creative stuff. And so this could really be an essential worker that could work across multiple teams because they just like this work.
It's a great perspective. Glad. Well, we're glad
Right.
this was
Awesome.
helpful for sure.
Thanks, guys, for
Yeah, thank you
joining
so
us. This
much.
was so fun.
Any other questions from the attendees? We don't have to stay until 2 if there's no other questions, but I want to make sure we get all those questions in before we end our session today.
Everybody loves 5 extra minutes in their day.
Yes.
I know it is. It is a
I
work
was
day,
I
and
was
I
in all
Thanks,
my
really
everyone.
classes
appreciate.
early, so
We have one question from Julie. What recommendations do you have for providing employees with the results of performance evaluations, which are often formulaic?
Mm.
Oh, um, I love this one because this is my specialty. I love operationally defining formulaic stuff. So I think um, I think what's going to be really important, again, I obviously don't have your particular system in front of me. I mean, I'm in my mind, I'm thinking numbers, right? You're one to like some sort of rating scale particular. But what I find on these evaluations is they really lack like like really making sure that your employee can walk away being like, this is exactly what would make you a five. I want you to think like black and white thinking. What would make this go up a number point? Yes, it's formulaic, but you need to operationally define this is the behaviors that I'm looking for, because it is, you're right, it's work performance behaviors for lack of a better term, right? Like I want you to contribute more like big picture ideas. This is an example of that, right? You currently, so my behavioral intervention this is on. When you give feedback, you have to give baseline. This is what I currently see. This is what I'm looking for. And it's not enough to just give one. You really need to give both, I think, to give effective feedback.
Yeah, the more descriptive, I think the better, right? And I think like something that seems clear to a manager, like communicate more clearly. Well, what does that mean? Is that going back to like the communication protocols that Jane was talking about? Like, if you have four different ways your team is communicating and each one is used for a different, has a different purpose, defining that could be very helpful.
And I'm so glad you brought up this because this is a nugget that I think is so important is it reminded me of an example of like you need to work on your relationships. Well, what does work what do effective define effective work relationships? Because to one person that doesn't mean I need to go to their birthday party or plan their shower or walk by their office and say, "Hi, how are you?" It means like I'm dependable when you come and ask me questions and get deliverables. So we really need to be careful about going back to social nuances, the relationship thing is like be better at making relationships, like increase your sphere of influence. Well, what does that mean? If we're talking in two totally social nuanced languages and I'm more like technically oriented, I also want to know the why. What does that have to do with my work performance? Um, and really get into the details of that. Oh gosh, I wish I could just do a whole thing on evaluations.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for the question, Julie.
Thanks, Julie.
Well, we've only got a minute or two left. We could take one more question, but if that person is just typing in their question, I want to just ask everybody to please fill out the survey that you'll see pop up on your screen when we're done, because we really want to get your feedback, not only on this presentation, wondering what to do next. So we just talked about evaluations. That seems to resonate with a lot of people. I'd love to know if that's a topic that we could cover in another session like this, or if maybe you need help with that in your organization, because we do that. Jane does that.
Or yeah, like
Nicole
a
and I work
workshop
with
that could be really cool.
organizations all the time to do work like this to improve their processes, build leadership skills in general. But that's a very specific project that we could work on, and I'd love to work with anyone on the call on something like that. Well, I'm not seeing any questions come in, so I'll just echo what Nicole and Jane have already said, and thank you all for joining. Thank you all for taking the time during your workday to do this. I really appreciate you.